you all back here again. Our first afternoon session is a Newsmaker interview with Dr. Omar Suleiman, the founder and president of the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research in Texas in the United States. Over the last few years, he has built the largest online following of any Muslim scholar or Muslim leader in the US. He has tried to work with a very particular vision of Islam, a vision of Islam that is deeply humanitarian and intertwined with social justice. His work has focused on Muslim identity and combating Islamophobia. It's a pleasure to welcome to the stage for a Newsmaker interview, Dr. Omar Suleiman. Dr. Omar Suleiman, you are a US citizen of Palestinian descent, born in New Orleans, which is known, of course, for its jazz and good Cajun cuisine, yet you decided to be a scholar, an adjunct professor at the Southern Methodist University in Texas, an author, a civil rights leader, an imam. You founded the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research in Texas. Tell us a little bit more about you and how a young Palestinian American chose this path for himself.
Well, sometimes you don't choose a path for yourself. In fact, it's divinely charted for you, and you simply go with the flow. And I had the blessing of being born and raised in New Orleans and not forsaking my Palestinian identity, but at the same time having, a typical New Orleans upbringing. And at the same time, witnessing in my own lifetime not just the inherited plight of my parents, but the plight of the people of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, which was the largest natural disaster in the history of our country, where we had to pull together as multiple communities to rebuild our city, and witnessing so many other turning points in the United States, which seems to be every day these days. And in that process, really finding a grounding in my faith and a vision through the lens of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and through the Abrahamic way of addressing and remedying the ills in society as we saw them.
I mentioned earlier that your vision of Islam is one that is both deeply humanitarian and intertwined with social justice. When you work towards combating Islamophobia, which has obviously made a resurgence post 9/11, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, when you work towards humanizing the oppressed, which is something that you care deeply about, how do you do that? How do you harmonize between religion and human rights?
So I think that the assumption often is that you have to adjust religion in order to be a part of the plight for human dignity. Whereas this is something that is entrenched deeply in the tradition of Islam. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have honored the child of Adam, is a verse in the Quran. The life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is filled with examples of that. And of course, as a Muslim, attributing all of that to the lives of the great prophets of old, the Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, Moses, peace be upon him, and others, where you find a lived tradition. Islam being the first explicitly anti-racist tradition in history, in the farewell speech of the Prophet, peace be upon him, where he says that there is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, or a non-Arab over an Arab, or a white man over a black man, or a black man over a white man, except by piety. And so it's not hard. I think that we often forget in the United States that the civil rights movement was a deeply religious movement. Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, who is possibly the most influential, at least impactful and influential Muslim in American history, of course the most famous one being his protege Muhammad Ali, was deeply entrenched in his faith, and it was his Hajj experience where he actually saw the dream that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about, when he saw people of all races and all classes coming together, and in embracing the oneness of God, embracing the oneness of their humanity. And of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So I think that the civil rights movement was a deeply religious movement in its inception. And I think that particularly as a Muslim, I don't have to look far to find a rich tradition, an explicit tradition that speaks to these lofty ideals of justice. I had the blessing of authoring a book called 40 on Justice, which looks at hadiths, traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that really shape our worldview. And they don't leave anything out of our purview except that it is touched by the loftier principles of Islam.
Clearly, from what you've just said, and from doing a quick search about you, your Wikipedia page reveals quite a bit about how much you've been influenced, as you say, by some of these figures of the civil rights movement, and by people like Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King, and before them, Frederick Douglass, an African-American slave who became a prominent slavery abolitionist in the early 19th century. But when one hears about Islam these days in America, and keeping in mind that Islam is the fastest growing faith in the United States, is it correct to suggest that Islam has been through two phases in recent years? Two distinct phases. The first one during the civil rights movement with the likes of Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, and as you say, the conversions of the greatest, Muhammad Ali, but also the post-9/11 phase, the second phase where Islam became almost overnight, suddenly synonymous with terrorism, with a sudden growth of Islamophobia. Is it fair to say that there have been two distinct phases of Islam?
I think you could maybe argue that there are two distinct phases in the pre-9/11 and the post-9/11, but then there are so many layers in between. So prior to the immigration bill, which comes directly as a result of some of the great African-American leaders, including Malcolm and Muhammad Ali, in 1966, Islam was an indigenous religion in the United States of America. Until today, the largest population of Muslims in America are African-American Muslims. But then you have this widespread of immigration to the United States of Muslims, and of course a growth that is compounded both by the continued wave of immigration as well as the conversion to Islam, as you said, that it is still the fastest growing religion in the United States. I think that post 9/11, you know, having grown up being the only Muslim in my school, going to a public school in the United States, Islam sparked a great curiosity before, and then it led to suspicion in the post 9/11 era. And what that did was it definitely put every Muslim on the defense, where you had to defend your very existence and your very identity. And what I'm most concerned with is the internalized impact of that. You know, when you talk about someone like Malcolm X, the greatest casualty in the eyes of Malcolm X of anti-black racism was black consciousness, who taught you to hate yourself, who taught you to hate the color of your skin and the shape of your nose and the texture of your hair. And so in a post-9/11 era, Muslims start to hate themselves in many ways. They start to adopt not just a defensive posture, but to adopt many of the same aversions to their faith, many of the same misconceptions and apprehensions towards their faith. And now we're caught politically between two extremes. And so on the one hand, you have the rise of the far right, Muslims being a convenient target of the far right, and Islam being related to a cancer in the United States that needs to be eradicated. And so in my mosque in Texas, and in fact in Texas, we're the only Muslim community in the country that has regular armed white supremacist protests in front of our mosques. COVID was the only thing that stopped that, because there were no more Muslims in the mosque for them to protest in front of. On the other hand, of that right-wing racism, outright bigotry that seeks annihilation of Muslims, you have the left, which is also plagued by Islamophobia. But it's a different type of Islamophobia. It's an Islamophobia that accepts an Islam and a Muslim community only as a subculture, and only to the extent that they adopt orthodoxies from the left. And so you're between annihilation or assimilation, as one scholar put it, and you're not allowed to really express your full Islamic identity without being deemed suspicious or unwelcomed or a convenient tick for either side.
But as you say, that there has been a changing landscape within the U.S. Political system. I mean, of course, there has been, as you say, the emergence of white nationalism in the United States, white supremacists as well. But on the other hand, you've had progressive voices who have now come up within the ranks of the U.S. Congress, young lawmakers with various backgrounds and heritages. You've got Palestinians, or Palestinian Americans, I should say, Somalis, Puerto Ricans, and so on. Is it, do you think, a coincidence, happenstance, or does it seem to be to you a direct reflection of the changing demographics in the United States, the US becoming this sort of growing melting pot, less and less white, more and more brown?
I think that those are certainly consequences of the growing, melting pot and diversity in the United States. I think that the challenge for American Muslims will be where they find political mobility and authentic expression and identity, and not being simply deemed as convenient political tools for any particular party. And so the ability of American Muslims to actually express themselves and have their own agenda and have their own identity and to be proud of who they are. And so I am hopeful that that will continue to be the case, and that, as we're coming out of it, it's been 20 years now. The effects of a post 9/11 world still definitely impact us as an American Muslim community, but I think that coming on the heels of 2 decades, hopefully you'll start to see more progress that comes out of this community and more authentic growth and representation out of it.
Do you feel that there's more activism and more confidence building within the new generation of young Arab Americans? You have a sizable online audience, as I say. You're one of the most prominent activists in the United States. How are you able to use the platforms that you have to change perceptions? Because, let me know if I'm mistaken, but I think you do see yourself first and foremost as a civil rights leader and then a Muslim scholar. But at the end of the day, in the United States, you will be seen as mainly Muslim, won't you? And some would accuse you, presumably, I think, of Islamic activism.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with the accusation. It's okay. I do everything rooted in my faith, and I think that that's okay. I think that if you ask, again, a person in the past like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., then he was acting out of his Christian consciousness. And so certainly, I think I am first and foremost concerned with my faith and what my faith means to me. But what my faith means to me is something that should not be threatening to society around me. And I think that's actually the point, that when we inherit the prevailing biases against the faith, then we immediately start to feel apprehensive. God describes the tree of faith in the Quran, and this is what I operate on, as a tree that is deeply rooted with branches high in the sky and in constant production of fruit. And so the idea here is that your shade that comes from the tree of faith should provide comfort to everyone and everything that's around you, and should not simply be something that is beneficial to you. And so our motto is to inspire contribution, to nurture conviction, and to inspire contribution. Because we believe that that's what our faith calls us to. And I think that more and more Muslims certainly will make those connections and are no longer afraid to express themselves as Muslims, but to also, in that expression, demonstrate the most beautiful ideals of service and mercy. I often share with my audience that the Prophet Muhammad is described as a mercy to the world, not as a mercy to the Muslims. And so what does your Islam mean as your mosques are growing to the homeless populations that are near you? What does that mean to the rising poverty rates? What does that mean to the comfort and healing of the society around you, both induced by political wounds and polarization, as well as economic hurt that we're all feeling these days?
And of course, the positions you have taken have not been without risks. You have strongly supported, taken a very clear stand on the issue of Palestine, which in the United States is not always an easy thing to do. You actively support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, which is being gradually criminalized in some US states and elsewhere in the West. You're being attacked on that front, but you're also being attacked by the Ku Klux Klan in Texas, which also has quite a presence. You're on the hit list of ISIS, which also sees you as an apostate imam, because you advocate unity among religions. Not an easy place to be. Don't you sometimes wish you stayed in New Orleans and maybe built your life around jazz? It certainly would have had fewer
I had a
risks for you.
basketball career ahead of me, but it didn't work out that way. Probably less people would want to kill me if I played basketball, unless I was playing really bad. But
you've had no regrets.
I have no regrets. Look, at some point, and I say this without any hesitation, you have to conquer your fear of death to live a meaningful life. And if you're going to take principled positions, at some point, those targets become irrelevant. Certainly, at times, you have to spiritually ground yourself and remind yourself about why you do what you do. But you can't live with that fear. Fear is paralyzing. And so whether it's, anti-Palestinian bigotry or anti-Muslim bigotry, people coming for my job or people coming for my life, I'm not the only one, not presently or in the past, and I do believe that it is God who ultimately protects.
To come back, though, briefly to the BDS movement and the controversy that seems to always build around this, I mentioned it was being criminalized in certain jurisdictions in the US, including at universities. Boycotts in support of the Palestinian struggle are illegal in many ways. At the same time, when it comes to, yes, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict today, boycott, sanctions, even the making of Molotov cocktails have been hailed at the highest levels of government and certainly within the media. We've all followed this, we've all seen it. A Palestinian hurling a Molotov cocktail at an Israeli IDF tank, opposing an illegal military occupation, is not accepted, is seen as a terrorist, and you know that. A Ukrainian doing the same on a Russian tank, meanwhile, is being hailed as a hero, as a freedom fighter. These double standards are nothing new. But how do you view them in today's context?
Well, I think that the question that I ask most people around me, especially in the context of Ukraine, if Rachel Corrie was in Ukraine and was photographed and ultimately lost her life standing in front of a Russian tank protesting a demolition, she would be considered the most influential person that year. She would be on the cover of Time magazine. She would be celebrated and lauded, rightfully so, for standing up for another oppressed people.
And remind everyone who Rachel Corrie is.
Rachel Corrie was an American peace activist who was murdered some 2 decades ago standing in front of an Israeli tank protesting home demolitions in Palestine. And so I think that if that's not a product of Islamophobia, I don't know what is. And that's the point. Both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are guilty of these double standards. The conservatives and the liberals, when you exceptionalize Muslims, because anti-Palestinian bigotry and Islamophobia at the state level are one and the same. They traffic in the same type of bigotry, which is that these are a people that should not be afforded the same level of human dignity and human rights and human struggle as any other group of people, because if you give them an inch, then their propensity to violence and barbarity will show. And so we must leave them under occupation, we must leave them tortured, we must leave them in this way. And so you come after the Palestinian activists on their university campuses, you exceptionalize their struggle by wrapping it in this deep theology that we cannot understand, so that when people see the same tactics being used by the IDF on the neck of a Palestinian in the courtyard of Masjid al-Aqsa that they saw on the neck of George Floyd, when they see the same type of occupation taking place there as they see in places like Ukraine, they can dismiss it on the basis of this is an exceptional conflict that we cannot yet understand, hence doing away with their natural human tendency to dignity.
And so how do you change this reality? Because it isn't a reality that just involves the Republican Democratic parties in the United States. It's much wider than this, isn't it? It's a deeply entrenched reality built on misperceptions, misconceptions, a misreading of history. Who knows? But it exists. How do you change this? What role do people like you, does each and every one of us
We will not
have
wait
to play?
for people to embrace our struggle in order to keep at it. We will not wait for anyone to validate our fighting for our liberation and our existence, our right to exist like any other group of people in the world. We will not wait for the mechanics of bigotry to stop working against us. We will not wait to be humanized to insist on our own humanity. And so I think that this, when it comes to pro-Palestinian activism,
And you touched on an important word, humanize,
yes,
which is often missing in the
yes, and when it
equation.
comes to pro-Palestinian activism, young Muslims, young Jews, young Christians, young people of all faiths and backgrounds are actually coalescing around the consensus that exists today that the Palestinian people live in an apartheid reality and that can no longer be denied on any rational or legal or moral basis.
And that must be heartwarming, that people of all faiths can and do come together, especially the new, younger generation, to speak up on behalf of the oppressed. Your final thoughts before we end.
I think that it is important for us to be morally consistent. And I think that the place of religious leaders in particular, in the United States and elsewhere, to not be masters or servants of the state, but to be the conscience of the state, to be the conscience of the people, to speak from a place of consistent moral principle, allows us to properly hold the purveyors of oppression accountable wherever they are. And I must end with this, because I was on a panel on Afghanistan, and I know that with Afghanistan there's been this rising conversation, as it should be, about the Taliban not allowing for young girls to go to school. And there's something in Islam about holding governments accountable to their promise, and so there should be a push, pressure, calling them to reverse that decision. But the entire framework for women's empowerment and education becomes deeply suspect when you are also an agent in their eradication. When you have 13,000 plus Afghan babies that have died as a result of the starvation of Afghanistan, when you have over 95% of Afghans living in food insecurity, and when you have a morally unconscionable decision, probably the most deplorable decision that was taken by the Biden administration since his term, to take away the funds from the Afghan people and to put it in the accounts of 9/11 survivors to suggest complicity, then you are trafficking in the same type of bigotry that harms Muslims, not just in the United States, but globally, that harms the Palestinian people, that harms the Afghan people, that harms the American people, and that ultimately lowers the bar for what morality actually looks like on a global stage. And I pray that we can be a part of ushering that in.
But these issues are not mutually exclusive. We should be able to focus on everything, giving girls the right, the basic right to education, while also making sure that people have their basic rights to everything they deserve, dignity above all else. Thank you so much, Dr. Omar Suleiman. Great pleasure to speak with you.